Hello and welcome back to our series of lectures on osmoregulation. In this video, we are going to be talking about aldosterone and the RAS pathway. Okay. All right. So I want to start by reminding you of the way that we process materials in the nephron. I want to remind you the beginning, what happens here in the proximal tubule, loop of Henle. All of that is just kind of automatic and unregulated, okay? And then by the time we get to the distal nephron, what happens is that we selectively secrete or reabsorb materials depending on our body's state at that moment, depending on what we need in order to achieve pH balance, salt balance, osmotic balance, etc. Okay. This process is regulated by hormones. So we just talked about how vasopressin, ADH, regulates the reabsorption of water in the distal nephron. Now I'm going to talk about how salt reabsorption is regulated in the distal nephron. Okay. So we have a hormone called aldosterone that regulates sodium reabsorption in the distal nephron. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about aldosterone. Aldosterone is made in the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex, as you might remember, or the adrenal gland, sits on top of the kidneys. Okay, so we have two of them, one on top of each kidney. This is what aldosterone looks like. That's what its structure is like. Okay, so before we talk about the mechanism of aldosterone action, I want you to consider these questions right here. So looking at the structure here, is aldosterone a steroid hormone or a peptide hormone? Okay, and then depending on that, would you expect it to bind to membrane receptors or to intracellular receptors? And then finally, would you expect aldosterone to stimulate fast cellular responses or slower genomic responses like changes in transcription translation? So consider those questions, hit pause if you need to. Okay, so hopefully you figured out that aldosterone, based on its structure, is a steroid hormone. And based on that, you should have been able to make predictions about its mechanism of action. So let's take a look at the mechanism of action of aldosterone and see if you were correct. Okay, so before we look at the action of aldosterone, I want to orient you to this figure. Once again, we are looking at the lumen of the tubule here, right? So this is the where the filtrate is. This is the material that is going to end up being the urine. Okay, here is our tubule wall. So this is the epithelial cell with its apical membrane, its basolateral membrane. Here we have our interstitial space, and here we have our bloodstream. Okay, so if we want to reabsorb sodium, that sodium is going to start over here. We're going to need to cross this membrane and then this membrane to get it back into the bloodstream. All right, now we're ready to look at the action of aldosterone. All right, so hopefully as you were able to predict based on the fact that aldosterone is a steroid hormone, it is going to bind to an intracellular receptor. That is step one here. Next, that combination of aldosterone with its receptor basically becomes a transcription factor, and it initiates transcription in the nucleus. Okay. As a result of that transcription and translation, we get synthesis of new ion channels. We get synthesis of new pumps in the membranes of this epithelial cell. We also get some modification of existing channels and pumps. And basically the modification is that we end up regulating them so that they are open for longer, okay? And as a result of that, we get increased sodium reabsorption, okay? So looking here, here's our sodium. Remember, we're starting with our sodium here. We have a channel here that wasn't there before, or maybe it's open for longer than it was before. So now that sodium can cross into the epithelial cell, and then we have this pump that wasn't there before. So now that sodium can get pumped out into the interstitial fluid where it then can diffuse into the bloodstream. Okay. I also want to point out that sodium reabsorption is coupled to the movement of other ions as well. So potassium secretion is coupled to sodium reabsorption. Um, and in that way, aldosterone also regulates our potassium levels. So taking a look at how that happens, I want to draw your attention to this ATPase, which you might have noticed is the sodium potassium ATPase, right? So when we reabsorb sodium, we are also, well, when we pump sodium out of the cell, we are also pumping potassium into the cell, this epithelial cell. Once it gets into the epithelial cell, it can then leave through these potassium channels where it will join the filtrate to be excreted from the body. Okay. And then also, chloride is going to follow the electrochemical gradient. So when sodium gets reabsorbed, chloride that is in the tubule here will follow it across the epithelial cell and back into the bloodstream.